He found her by accident, not in a grave, not in a file, but standing upright under glass at a charity gala. After 20 years chasing a missing girl, the retired detective realized the truth was far worse than murder. She hadn't been buried. She had been preserved and displayed while the men responsible built careers on silence. Marcus Reed hadn't planned on leaving his house that night. Retirement had stripped time of its urgency, and evenings had become long. Quiet stretches filled with unfinished coffee, and the low hum of the television he never really watched. The invitation to the charity gala sat unopened on his desk, until his daughter picked it up herself, reading it aloud with forced cheer. As if the right tone might pull him back into the world. She said he needed air, noise. People, anything that wasn't the small back room where old case files still lived in cardboard boxes like unburied bonds. Marcus didn't argue. He never did when she looked at him that way. He put on the suit that hadn't fit quite right since the funeral years ago, tied his tie unevenly, and followed her out into the warm Louisiana night, feeling like a guest in someone else's life. The gala was held downtown, where the river curved like a dark thought behind the glass and steel of the convention center. Inside, everything gleamed. Crystal lights hung overhead, scattering reflections across polished floors and expensive shoes. People laughed too loudly, leaned close to be heard over the music, spoke about donations and expansions and legacies. Marcus moved through the room slowly, his posture stiff, his hands unused to being empty. He noticed the exits first, then the security guards, habits that refused to die just because the badge was gone. His daughter drifted ahead, greeting colleagues, introducing him as if he were something fragile but valuable, an artifact to be displayed with care. Marcus nodded, smiled when required, waited for the night to pass. It was the display cases along the outer wall that finally pulled him away from the crowd. 12 of them, evenly spaced, each enclosing a life-sized wax figure dressed in historical costume. A placard explained they were antique medical teaching models on loan from a private collection. Marcus leaned in despite himself. The craftsmanship was unsettling: skin rendered with careful imperfections, veins faint beneath the surface, lips parted as if mid-breath. These weren't caricatures. They were studies. He moved from one to the next without interest, eyes sliding over faces that meant nothing to him. A nurse from another century, a surgeon frozen in a gesture of instruction, a soldier laid bare for anatomy lessons. Then he reached the final case, set slightly apart, positioned near the stage lights like something meant to be seen. The figure wore golden linen, styled as an Egyptian queen, one arm raised, chin lifted in eternal address. Marcus felt it before he understood it, a tightening behind the ribs, a quiet internal alarm he hadn't heard in years. He stepped closer, the room falling away around him. The face wasn't dramatic, that was the problem. It was ordinary in the way real faces are ordinary, shaped by genetics and chance rather than myth. The cheekbones, the curve of the jaw, the faint asymmetry that no sculptor invents, unless they are copying something true. Then his eyes locked onto hers, and the world narrowed to color. One brown, one hazel, the right darker than the left, not a trick of lighting, not glass catching reflection. Marcus's breath stalled. He had memorized that pattern once, long ago, back when hope had still been a professional requirement. He saw it in dreams sometimes, those mismatched eyes blinking open in the dark, accusing and patient all at once. His hand moved on its own, pulling his phone from his pocket. The photo was still there, buried in a folder that had followed him through 3 decades and 2 marriages and 1 retirement. He didn't need to zoom in. He already knew what he would see. When he held the screen up beside the glass, the alignment was merciless. Brown right, hazel left, same spacing, same quiet defiance in the gaze. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. Summer heat, a missing poster curling at the edges. A mother sitting too straight in an interview room, refusing to cry because crying felt like giving up. A girl who had walked out of a building and never arrived anywhere else. Marcus had chased that absence through paperwork and alleys and dead ends until the case went cold and everyone told him it was time to move on. He never had. He had only learned how to carry it. And now here it was, illuminated, admired, named after a queen, while the band played and Donner's raised glasses a few feet away. Someone spoke to him. He didn't hear the words at first. A hand gestured, indicating the distance he was standing from the glass. Marcus nodded automatically, stepped back half a pace, but his eyes never left the figure. He could feel his pulse in his throat. This wasn't recognition in the abstract. This was certainty, heavy and unwelcome. Faces change with time. Bones do not. You don't spend 30 years looking for people without learning the difference. His daughter appeared at his side, her voice low, concerned, asking what was wrong. Marcus didn't answer right away. He turned the phone so she could see the photograph. Then the figure. Then the photograph again. He watched disbelief fight with logic on her face. Watched doubt give way to something colder. Around them, the gala continued. Applause rose and fell as a man on stage spoke about service and compassion. About the long arc of a medical career dedicated to helping the vulnerable. Marcus barely registered it. All he could think about was the simple, unbearable fact that if he was right, and he knew he was, then the girl he had promised to find had never really been missing. She had been hidden in plain sight, transformed into something people could admire without asking questions. His chest tightened, not with triumph, but with a slow, spreading anger that felt almost calm. Accidents don't look like this. Coincidences don't stare back at you with familiar eyes. Whatever story the glass cases were telling, Marcus Reed knew, with the clarity that only obsession and time can give, that it was a lie. The realization followed him out of the ballroom, like a second shadow. Marcus barely remembered leaving, only that the music felt suddenly obscene, and the laughter sharp enough to hurt. The night air outside the convention center pressed damp and heavy against his face, carrying the smell of the river and hot asphalt. His daughter walked beside him in silence, her heels clicking too fast. Her phone clenched in her hand as if it might ring with an explanation that could undo what they had just seen. Marcus stood near the curb for a long moment, staring at nothing, his mind already slipping backward, rearranging old memories with brutal efficiency. If the figure was who he thought it was, then the truth wasn't just strange, it was monstrous. It meant the girl hadn't vanished into chaos or chance. It meant she had been taken, altered, curated, her absence turned into something deliberate. Back home, Marcus couldn't sit still. The house felt wrong, too quiet, as if it were listening. He moved from room to room, touching familiar objects without really seeing them. Finally ending up in the small office he had never cleaned out after retirement. The boxes were still there, stacked against the wall, labeled in his own handwriting. He pulled one open and the smell of old paper and dust rose up, instantly familiar. Inside were copies of reports, photographs, handwritten notes from interviews conducted when he had still believed persistence alone could bend the world toward justice. He spread them across the desk, not because he needed to read them, but because he needed to see them exist, to anchor himself to something solid. The girl's face looked back at him from glossy paper, younger than the one in the glass case, but unmistakably the same person. The same eyes. Always the eyes. Sleep never came. Every time he closed his own eyes, he saw hers again, unblinking and patient, trapped behind glass while strangers admired the craftsmanship. Sometime before dawn, his daughter appeared in the doorway, hair pulled back hastily, the lines of worry too deep for someone her age. She said she'd been thinking all night too, that she couldn't make the image leave her head. Marcus nodded. He hadn't expected anything else. You don't grow up around unresolved grief without learning how to recognize it when it wakes you in the dark. He told her what he hadn't said at the gala, that this was worse than finding a body in the ground. A grave would have meant an ending, however painful. This was something else entirely. This was an answer wrapped in desecration. The following days passed in a strange, suspended state. Marcus avoided calls, ignored the news coverage praising the gala and its honored guest, and focused instead on details that refused to line up. Antique medical models were rare, yes, but not undocumented. Provenance mattered in that world. Collectors kept records. Museums demanded them. Yet when Marcus replayed the conversation in his head, all he remembered was vagueness, deflection, irritation where curiosity should have been. The man on stage had spoken eloquently about ethics, about the responsibility of medicine to protect the vulnerable. Marcus had heard those speeches before, usually right before someone was exposed for violating everything they claimed to stand for. Experience had taught him that hypocrisy often wore the best suits. His daughter brought him coffee one morning and sat across from him, laptop open, the glow reflecting in her eyes. She worked with data for a living, medical systems, patient identification protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of erasure Marcus had spent his career fighting. She didn't say what she was thinking at first. She just turned the screen toward him, showing software interfaces he barely understood, lines of code and skeletal diagrams overlaid with grids. Finally, she spoke, carefully as if approaching a wound. There were ways to compare faces, she said, not just by surface resemblance but by underlying structure. Bone ratios, eye placement, metrics that didn't care about age or lighting or costume. It wouldn't prove anything legally on its own, but it would tell them whether Marcus was chasing a ghost or standing at the edge of something real. They worked quietly, side by side, like they used to when she was a child doing homework at the kitchen table. Marcus watched as she uploaded images, one old school photograph scanned from a file, one still frame taken discreetly at the gala. The program processed them without emotion, reducing a human life to points and distances, probabilities calculated in fractions of seconds. Marcus felt a flicker of guilt at that, at turning a girl who had already been objectified into more data. But he told himself this was different. This was a step toward naming what had been stolen from her. The result appeared on the screen with clinical detachment, numbers glowing against a neutral background. High probability, structural match well beyond chance. Marcus closed his eyes, not in relief, but in resignation. He had hoped, against reason, that he would be wrong. Confirmation didn't bring clarity, it brought consequences. Almost immediately, the phone calls began, subtle at first. Missed calls from blocked numbers. A voicemail with no message, just breathing in a click. Marcus had spent too long in law enforcement not to recognize the language of intimidation. Someone knew he was looking. Someone didn't want him to keep going. His daughter noticed it too, the way he checked the locks twice before bed, the way he paused before opening emails. She argued that it was time to involve the police, to hand this over to people who still carried badges and legal authority. Marcus shook his head. He knew how institutions protected themselves, how reputations weighed heavier than truth until the evidence became impossible to ignore. They weren't there yet. He could feel it. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Names that appeared too often together. Old affiliations buried in professional bios. A network of influence that explained the confidence, the assumption of untouchability. Marcus had seen it before in other contexts, different crimes, same structure. Power insulated itself. Money blurred edges. People disappeared quietly when they threatened the narrative. The wax figures took on a new meaning in his mind, no longer curiosities but trophies, a grotesque archive of lives reduced to silence. 12 cases, 12 displays. The symmetry made his stomach turn. When the first direct threat came, it wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no explicit violence. Just a calm suggestion that he was mistaken, that continuing would cause unnecessary pain, especially to those he loved. The implication hung in the air long after the call ended. Marcus sat at his desk, hands flat on the wood, and felt the weight of the choice settle over him. He could stop. He could walk away and let the story remain a rumor in his own head, a nightmare no one else had to carry. Or, he could accept what he had always known about himself, that he was incapable of leaving certain things unfinished. Retirement had taken his authority, not his responsibility. He picked up the phone and called his daughter, told her to pack a bag and not ask questions. If this was going to end, it would end with the truth, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. By the time he stepped back into the world, Marcus Reed no longer thought of the case as an old wand reopened. It was something new now, something alive, watching him as closely as he was watching it. The accident at the gala had stripped away the last layer of doubt. Whatever waited at the center of this story, it wasn't coincidence or nostalgia or a grieving man seeing what he wanted to see. It was intent. It was design. And Marcus understood, with a cold certainty that steadied rather than frightened him, that once you recognize that kind of evil, the only real choice left is whether you look away or walk straight toward it. The third truth Marcus Reed had to face arrived slowly, not as a revelation but as a pressure that refused to ease. It settled into him over the following weeks, tightening every time he replayed the image of the wax figure in his mind. This wasn't just about resemblance or probability anymore. It was about intent. Someone had made a choice, years ago, to stop a life, and then decide what to do with what remained. Murder, even when hidden, usually carried some trace of haste or panic. This did not. This was careful, considered. The girl had not been discarded or buried in secret. She had been transformed, preserved with precision, placed in a context meant to inspire admiration. That level of deliberation disturbed Marcus more than any act of violence he had seen in his career. He began reconstructing the past not as a cold case, but as a timeline of opportunity. Every movement of the girl's last known days took on new significance. The summer she disappeared had been brutally hot, the kind of heat that slowed people down and dulled their awareness. College campuses emptied out except for students who couldn't afford to go home. Marcus remembered that detail clearly. It had been one of the reasons he believed she'd been vulnerable. Now it looked like a condition someone else might have exploited. He spread maps across his desk, tracing routes she would have walked, buildings she would have entered, offices where paperwork would have been signed without much thought. Disappearances rarely happened in isolation. They were intersections of need and access, trust and authority. What haunted him most was the absence of chaos. There had been no witnesses because nothing had looked wrong. No screams, no struggle. Whatever happened had worn the disguise of legitimacy. Marcus had learned long ago that the most effective crimes often hid behind credentials and clean floors. Doctors, researchers, administrators, people trained to speak calmly, to reassure, to ask for consent. He imagined the girl sitting in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic, being told this was temporary, safe, important. He imagined her believing it, because why wouldn't she? Society teaches you to trust certain uniforms. That trust, once weaponized, becomes devastatingly efficient. As the days passed, Marcus found himself thinking less about how she died and more about what happened afterward. The decision to preserve a body required time, equipment, and expertise. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It suggested planning beyond the immediate crisis, a willingness to solve one problem by creating another far more grotesque one. Someone had looked at a dead teenager and seen not a failure, not a life lost, but a liability to be managed. That reframing chilled Marcus. It was the language of systems, not individuals, the kind of thinking that allows people to justify the indefensible by calling it necessary. He revisited the display in his memory again and again, noting details he hadn't registered at first. The placement of the figure near the stage. The lighting chosen to flatter rather than obscure. The label written with confidence, not defensiveness. This wasn't something hidden away in a basement, brought out reluctantly. It was curated, presented, almost celebrated. Marcus realized that the brazenness was part of the protection. No one expects the truth to be displayed so openly. Suspicion looks paranoid when the lie is dressed as culture and history. He had walked past the other figures without a second glance. Most people would do the same. The implications extended beyond one victim. Marcus had spent enough time in missing persons to recognize patterns when they emerged, and his mind kept returning to the number. 12 figures. 12 cases. The thought made his chest tighten. If this was a method, not an anomaly, then the story was much larger than he had allowed himself to imagine. He resisted that conclusion at first. It was easier to believe in a singular horror than in a system that repeated it. But denial had never served him well. He had learned that ignoring uncomfortable connections only delayed the inevitable reckoning. His daughter noticed the change in him. He spoke less, ate without tasting, slept in short, restless stretches. When she asked what he was thinking, he told her the truth, or as much of it as he could put into words. That the problem wasn't just that the girl had been killed. It was that her death had been absorbed into an apparatus, designed to continue operating, as if nothing had happened. Institutions were good at that. They smoothed over ruptures, reassigned blame, rewrote narratives. The girl's disappearance had been an inconvenience, and someone had made it disappear the way organizations often do, by reframing it as something else entirely. Marcus began to feel the weight of responsibility shift. For years, he had carried guilt for not finding her in time. Now that guilt transformed into something sharper. He had found her, in a sense, but finding wasn't the same as rescuing. The truth arrived too late to save her, yet still demanded action. That paradox defined the rest of his life more clearly than any badge ever had. He understood that this wasn't about closure, a word people use to comfort themselves. It was about interruption, about stopping a mechanism that would continue unless someone jammed it. Consequences be damned. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the figure itself was a message, whether intended or not. It said, this is what happens when you cross the wrong line. It said bodies can be repurposed, stories rewritten. It said power decides what is remembered and what is erased. Marcus felt a familiar anger rise, but it was tempered by something steadier. Determination, honed by years of watching justice arrive late or not at all. He knew he couldn't undo what had been done, but he could refuse to let it remain ornamental. There were moments, usually just before dawn, when doubt crept in. He wondered if he was projecting meaning where none existed, if grief had sharpened his instincts into weapons against himself. Those moments never lasted. He had trusted his gut enough times to know when it was warning him rather than misleading him. The silence surrounding the figure, the evasiveness, the subtle threats, these were not the reactions of people confident in their innocence. They were the behaviors of those accustomed to control, suddenly confronted with unpredictability. By the time Marcus accepted the full scope of what the third truth meant, he no longer thought of himself as chasing a cold case. He was stepping into a current that had been flowing for decades, one fed by money, reputation, and the quiet disappearance of inconvenient lives. The girl in the glass case had become a symbol of that current, a visible endpoint of an invisible process. Marcus understood now that seeing her wasn't an accident of fate. It was a collision between persistence and arrogance. Someone had assumed no one would ever look closely enough. They were wrong. That understanding hardened into resolve. Marcus Reed had spent his career learning how systems fail and how people exploit those failures. He had seen justice delayed, denied, diluted. But he had also seen what happened when someone refused to accept the story they were given. The figure at the gala had stripped away any remaining illusion that this would be simple or safe. It had also clarified something essential. This wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about challenging the present, about forcing a reckoning in a world that preferred its horrors beautifully displayed and never questioned. The fourth truth lived in memory, not evidence. And it was the one Marcus Reed had never been able to set down. Long before the gala, before wax and glass and quiet threats, there had been a small interview room with beige walls and a flickering fluorescent light. He could still see it clearly if he let himself. The chair across from him had been occupied by a woman who held herself too tightly, as if loosening her grip might cause her to break apart. Her name was Denise Thompson, and she was trying very hard not to cry because she believed, with the fierce logic of grief, that tears might somehow make her daughter harder to find. Marcus had been young then, new enough to the job that he still believed every case ended with answers if you worked hard enough. He had sat across from her and asked the questions he was trained to ask, all the while sensing that none of them were sufficient. Her daughter Naya had disappeared on an ordinary afternoon. No storm, no argument, no warning signs dramatic enough to feel like foreshadowing. She had left a campus building carrying a backpack that held notebooks, a half-finished essay, and a future that still felt negotiable. Witnesses remembered seeing her walking alone, unhurried, her phone tucked away. That detail had stuck with Marcus. People in danger often clutched their phones. Naya hadn't. Whatever met her on that walk hadn't looked like a threat. It had looked like something routine enough to ignore. That realization would haunt Marcus for years, long after the case file gathered dust. Denise Thompson had brought photographs to the station, laying them out carefully as if order might impose meaning on chaos. School portraits, candid shots at family cookouts, a picture taken at the beach where Naya squinted against the sun, one eye darker than the other. Denise apologized for the quality of some of the photos, as if Marcus were judging her. He wasn't. He was studying the girl's face, already committing it to memory, knowing instinctively that he would need to. When Denise finally asked if Marcus thought her daughter was still alive, he hesitated just long enough to hate himself for it. Then he said what he believed at the time, what he needed to believe. Yes, we were going to find her. That promise became a weight he carried into every subsequent case. Marcus worked Naya's disappearance with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He retraced routes, re-interviewed witnesses, chased rumors that dissolved on contact. He checked hospitals, shelters, bus stations, anywhere a missing teenager might surface. Each dead end sharpened his resolve rather than dulling it. He visited Denise regularly, updating her even when there was nothing new to say. She listened without interrupting, her hope thinning but never quite disappearing. Over time, Marcus learned to recognize the difference between hope and endurance. Denise had shifted into the latter, without ever acknowledging it aloud. When the case officially went cold, the notification felt like a betrayal. Marcus understood the language of resources and priorities, but he couldn't accept the implication that time alone diminished responsibility. He continued working the case unofficially, pulling files late at night, following up on tips no one else thought worth pursuing. Other detectives moved on, took promotions, retired. Marcus stayed. He watched Denise's age in small, devastating increments. He watched birthdays pass uncelebrated, holidays lose their shape. Every year, on the anniversary of Naya's disappearance, Denise called him, and every year he answered. Even when he had nothing to offer but his continued attention, the guilt settled in quietly. Marcus told himself he was doing everything he could, yet the question persisted, what if he had missed something obvious? What if the right question, asked at the right time, would have changed everything? That kind of doubt has a way of eroding certainty from the inside out. It followed him home, into his marriage, into his sleep. He dreamed of Nia sometimes, not as she was in the photographs, but older, standing just out of reach, her mismatched eyes steady and unblaming. Those dreams were worse than nightmares. They suggested patience, not anger, and that felt like an accusation all its own. Years later, when Marcus stood in front of the wax figure, all of that history surged back with brutal clarity. This was not the reunion he had imagined. He had pictured finding Nia alive somewhere unexpected, or at least uncovering a truth that could be spoken plainly. He had not imagined discovering her transformed into an object, her humanity repurposed into something ornamental. The promise he had made to Denise echoed in his mind, altered but unbroken. We were going to find her. He had, in the narrowest sense. But finding her like this felt like another failure layered on top of the first. What hurt most was realizing how long Denise had waited for an answer, while the truth sat on display. Marcus imagined her moving through her life, carrying uncertainty like a permanent ache, while people in evening gowns admired the artistry of what had been stolen from her. The injustice of it made his hands shake. This wasn't just a crime against Naya. It was a sustained cruelty inflicted on everyone who loved her. Marcus understood then that the passage of time hadn't dulled the harm. It had compounded it, allowing indifference to calcify into tradition. The weight of that realization pushed Marcus past hesitation. He was no longer driven solely by professional instinct or personal pride. He was driven by the knowledge that Denise deserved more than explanations wrapped in technical language. She deserved the truth in its raw form, no matter how painful. Marcus knew that once he spoke it aloud, there would be no retreat. The world would look different afterward, stripped of comforting ambiguity. He accepted that cost. He had lived with ambiguity long enough. In quiet moments, Marcus wondered whether Denise would forgive him for how long it had taken. He rehearsed conversations in his head, none of them adequate. There are no words that make 20 years disappear. Still, he believed that truth, however late, carried a kind of moral gravity. It pulled toward accountability, toward recognition. The alternative silence felt like complicity. Marcus had spent too many years watching systems protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. He refused to let that pattern repeat unchallenged. By the time he committed fully to reopening the past, Marcus understood that this chapter of the story wasn't about discovery. It was about obligation. The girl who had vanished on an ordinary afternoon had become a symbol of everything that could be hidden when power went unchecked. The mother who had waited all those years had become the measure of what justice owed. Even when it arrived broken and incomplete, Marcus carried them both with him as he moved forward, not as abstractions, but as people whose lives intersected with his in ways that could never be undone. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with certainty. Walking away now would be the final, unforgivable failure. The fifth truth revealed itself not in emotion but in precision. Marcus Reed had spent most of his career learning when feelings lied, and when details did not. Grief could distort memory, but structure rarely did. Bone did not lie. Proportion did not lie. Once the initial shock faded, once the weight of memory settled into something steadier, Marcus returned to what had always grounded him: observation. He replayed the image of the wax figure again and again, stripping away costume, lighting, symbolism, until all that remained was anatomy. Faces at their core were architecture, and architecture left signatures. He began by forcing himself to slow down. Panic and anger were useful fuels, but they blurred edges. He sat at his desk and pulled the old photographs back out, laying them flat, aligning them carefully. The school portrait, the candid shots. The image Denise had once apologized for, because the lighting was bad. Marcus didn't care about lighting. He cared about ratios. He measured with his eyes first, then with tools he had learned to trust over decades: spacing between the eyes, width of the nasal bridge, the subtle asymmetry where one cheekbone rose just a fraction higher than the other. He had learned long ago that faces were rarely symmetrical, and that asymmetry was often the most identifying feature of all. When he compared those details to the photograph he had taken of the wax figure, the feeling that settled in his chest was not surprise, but inevitability. The curve of the jaw matched in a way that was almost intimate, a slope Marcus recognized immediately. The ears, often overlooked, were identical in their slight outward tilt, and the distinctive fold at the top. Even the distance from the base of the nose to the upper lip fell within the same narrow range. These were not traits a sculptor would accidentally replicate unless working from a model. And this sculptor had gone far beyond approximation. This was replication. Marcus had seen mistaken identifications before. Families convinced that a stranger was their missing loved one because hope demanded it. Witnesses certain they recognized a suspect because fear had rewritten their memory. This was not that. This was pattern recognition sharpened by years of restraint. He wasn't trying to prove himself right. He was trying desperately to prove himself wrong. Every comparison only reinforced the same conclusion. The similarities were not cosmetic. They were structural, and structure meant origin. His daughter watched him work in silence. She recognized the shift in him, the way his movements became economical, deliberate. This was the man she remembered from her childhood. The version of her father who could sit for hours with a single problem and refused to let it intimidate him. When she finally spoke, it was to offer confirmation from her own discipline. Faces, she said, were more stable over time than people realized. Weight changed, hair changed, expression changed, bone did not. Age layered itself onto structure but rarely erased it. What Marcus was seeing wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. They ran the analysis together, but even before the software returned its results, Marcus already knew what it would say. The numbers simply translated instinct into language the system respected. High probability, minimal deviation, insignificant margin of error. Marcus stared at the screen not with relief, but with a deepening sense of responsibility. Data carried weight. Once generated, it demanded response. You could not unknow what had been quantified. The truth had crossed a threshold. It was no longer personal. It was demonstrable. What unsettled Marcus most was how intentional the preservation appeared to be. The figure was not a generic likeness. It captured age accurately, freezing the girl at precisely the point she had vanished. No attempt had been made to alter or anonymize her features beyond costume. That suggested pride, or at least indifference to discovery. Someone had believed the disguise was sufficient. That context would do the work of concealment. Dress a truth as history and people stop asking questions. Marcus had underestimated that tactic for years. Now he saw it clearly. The realization forced him to confront something he had avoided since the gala. This wasn't just a matter of identifying a victim. It was about confronting a mindset capable of aestheticizing death. Turning a human being into an artifact required emotional distance bordering on pathology. Marcus had encountered killers who compartmentalized, but this was different. This was not rage or desperation. This was curation. The person responsible had not only accepted what they had done, but had integrated it into a collection meant to be admired. That distinction mattered. It spoke to motive, to repetition, to scale. Marcus felt the investigation pivot in his mind. Up until now he had been chasing a singular answer: is this her? With that question resolved, another rose in its place, heavier and more dangerous. How many times had this happened? The figure was one among 12, each given a name, a story, a false past. Marcus imagined applying the same scrutiny to the others, stripping them of their narratives one by one. The thought made his stomach knot. If this method had been used repeatedly, then the wax wasn't just preservation. It was inventory. The implications reshaped his sense of time. The case was no longer 20 years old. It was ongoing. Whatever system had allowed this to happen had not vanished with the disappearance of a single girl. It had adapted, learned, protected itself. Marcus understood then why the discovery felt so wrong. He hadn't stumbled onto a relic. He had brushed against something still alive, still benefiting from silence. The accuracy of the figure wasn't an accident. It was evidence of confidence. Confidence born of never being challenged. As the days passed, Marcus found that the clarity brought no peace. Certainty was not comfort. It was obligation sharpened to a point. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw not just the girl's face, but the choices that had shaped it into what he had seen behind glass. He thought of denies of the years she had spent describing her daughter's face to strangers who nodded politely and eventually stopped calling. He thought of how close the truth had been all along, how visible, how carefully disguised. That knowledge settled into him like a vow. Marcus Reed had spent his career believing that answers lived in files and witnesses and confessions. This case taught him something else. Sometimes the truth stands directly in front of you, illuminated, labeled, applauded, and still goes unseen because acknowledging it would require dismantling too much. He understood now that recognizing the face was only the beginning. The real work lay ahead, in forcing the world to see what he could no longer look away from. The sixth truth revealed itself through resistance. Marcus Reed had learned to pay attention when people grew careful instead of curious. Innocence in his experience, asked questions, guilt closed ranks. When he finally approached Jar Leonard Whitmore after the gala, it wasn't with accusation, but with the practiced neutrality of a man asking for context. He chose his words deliberately, framing his interest as professional curiosity, even admiration. Collections like this, he said, were rare. Medical history was often lost to time. He wanted to understand how such pieces were acquired, preserved, documented. It was the sort of inquiry Whitmore should have welcomed. Instead, the doctor's response carried a subtle but unmistakable edge. Whitmore smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He spoke quickly, offering generalities instead of specifics, describing estate sales and forgotten archives without naming institutions or dates. Marcus noticed how often he referenced time as a blur decades ago, many years back, long before records were properly kept. It was the language of someone accustomed to not being challenged. When Marcus asked about documentation, the smile tightened. Provenance, Whitmore said, was complicated with artifacts this old. Records were incomplete. Some had been lost. It was a familiar deflection, one Marcus had heard from Mannix explaining away missing funds or misfiled evidence. Vagueness masquerading as inevitability. What struck Marcus was not what Whitmore said, but what he did next. The conversation ended abruptly. Not politely concluded, but shut down. Whitmore's posture shifted, shoulders squaring, voice cooling. He suggested Marcus enjoy the rest of the evening, implied the questions were inappropriate given the celebratory context. Within moments, security appeared, summoned with efficiency that suggested rehearsal rather than improvisation. Marcus had seen that look before, the one that weighed risk and decided containment was easier than explanation. It confirmed what instinct already knew. Whitmore was not afraid of being misunderstood. He was afraid of being understood too well. The removal from the Gala was swift and humiliating, designed to reassert hierarchy. Marcus didn't resist. He let it happen, aware that force would only strengthen the narrative. Whitmore wanted an unbalanced retiree disrupting a dignified event. As he was escorted out, he caught one last glimpse of the wax figure, her face serene behind glass. The contrast between her stillness and the sudden urgency surrounding him hardened something inside his chest. Truth, he thought, always triggered overreaction in those who depended on silence. Outside, the night felt colder than it should have. His daughter was furious, embarrassed, confused. Marcus listened without interrupting, letting her words spill out because he knew she needed to say them. When she finished, he told her quietly that Whitmore's reaction mattered more than any argument they could have had inside. If the figure were harmless, if it truly belonged to the distant past Whitmore claimed, there would have been no need to escalate. Documentation could have ended the conversation in seconds. Instead, Whitmore had chosen authority over clarity. That choice spoke volumes. In the days that followed, Marcus replayed every detail of the exchange, examining it the way he once reviewed interrogation footage. The micro-expressions, the deflection points, the moment Whitmore realized Marcus wasn't admiring the collection, but interrogating it. There had been a flicker then, brief but unmistakable, something like calculation. Marcus recognized it as the look of a man deciding how much power he needed to exert. That look didn't belong to someone protecting a reputation. It belonged to someone protecting a secret. Marcus began researching Whitmore's public life, not because he expected to find overt wrongdoing, but because patterns often revealed themselves in the margins. Awards, honors, testimonials, a spotless record carefully curated over decades. Whitmore was known for his service to underserved communities, for his advocacy, for his generosity. Marcus didn't doubt that much of it was real. People were rarely all one thing. That was part of what made them dangerous. The good provided cover. The trust it generated insulated everything else. What troubled Marcus was how seamlessly Whitmore moved between roles. Physician collector, benefactor, benefacator. Each identity reinforced the others, creating a web of credibility that made scrutiny feel disrespectful. Marcus understood, then, why no one else had questioned the figures. To do so would require challenging not just an object, but an entire narrative of benevolence. Most people preferred comfort over confrontation. Whitmore had built his life on that preference. The resistance didn't end with the Gala. Calls went unanswered. Emails received polite, non-committal replies or none at all. Requests for information were redirected, delayed, buried under layers of protocol. Marcus felt the invisible barriers rise, the institutional immune response activating. He had stepped into a space protected not just by individuals, but by systems designed to minimize disruption. The lesson was clear: this was not going to unravel easily. The truth had been insulated with time, respectability, and power. And yet, the resistance also clarified something else. Whitmore's refusal to engage was not a denial. It was a boundary. Boundaries existed to protect something. Marcus had spent years learning where to apply pressure, how to test the strength of a wall by observing how fiercely it was guarded. Whitmore guarded this fiercely. That alone elevated the significance of the figure from suspicion to focal point. You don't deploy authority unless there's something at stake. Marcus found himself thinking about how many times Whitmore had told the story of his collection. How many rooms he had stood in explaining its value, its history, its educational importance. Had he ever worried someone would look too closely? Or had he grown complacent, trusting that context would always do the work for him? Marcus suspected the latter. Arrogance often grew in the absence of challenge. The gala had been a display of confidence, not caution. The reaction to Marcus's questions suggested that confidence had limits. By the end of the week, Marcus no longer framed Whitmore as a man with answers. He framed him as a man with control. Control over information, control over access, control over narrative, and control, Marcus knew, was rarely surrendered voluntarily. It had to be pried loose, often at great personal cost. The confrontation at the gala was no longer an embarrassment to be forgotten. It was a turning point, a line crossed. Marcus Reed had spent his career chasing people who ran when confronted. Whitmore didn't run. He stood his ground and called for backup. That distinction mattered. It meant Whitmore believed himself protected. It meant the truth Marcus was circling wasn't just personal, it threatened something larger, something entrenched. As Marcus looked ahead, he understood that the path forward would not be about asking permission or appealing to reason. It would be about persistence, about forcing light into spaces that had grown comfortable in shadow. The resistance had confirmed it. He was no longer searching for answers, he was challenging power. The seventh truth arrived wrapped in humiliation, and Marcus Reed understood immediately why it mattered. Being escorted out of the gala wasn't just a reaction, it was a message. Power does not merely remove obstacles, it makes examples of them. The guards were polite but firm, hands light but unyielding on his arms, guiding him through a room that had gone uncomfortably quiet. Conversations stalled mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips. Faces turned, curious and cautious, registering him not as a man with a question but as a disruption. Marcus felt the familiar burn of public judgment, the kind that doesn't require facts to do its work. He had worn that look before, usually in courtrooms or press conferences, but never like this, never stripped of authority, never framed as the problem itself. The doors closed behind him with a sound that felt final, heavy enough to echo. Outside, the city went on as if nothing had happened. Traffic moved, music drifted from nearby bars, the contrast was jarring. Inside, something unspeakable had just been defended with ceremony and force. Outside, life continued unbothered. Marcus stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, grounding himself. Anger would come later. Right now, he needed clarity. He turned to his daughter, whose face was flushed with embarrassment and fury, and told her quietly that this was confirmation. People didn't respond like that unless they had something to lose. She argued with him then, not because she thought he was wrong, but because she understood the cost. Reputation was a blunt instrument, and once swung, it was difficult to stop. Marcus was no longer a detective in good standing. He was a retired man making accusations against a respected physician at a charitable event. The narrative wrote itself, and it wasn't in his favor. Marcus listened, nodded, acknowledged every risk she named. He had lived with those risks for most of his adult life. What she didn't yet see, what he did, was that the response they just witnessed had shifted the ground beneath them. This was no longer speculation. This was containment. In the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Marcus's name appeared in quiet conversations, framed carefully, softened with concern. People asked if he was doing all right. They mentioned stress, retirement, the difficulty of letting go. The implication was subtle but clear. He was unstable. His questions had not been inappropriate, because they threatened the truth, but because they came from a man who could no longer be trusted to know what the truth looked like. Marcus recognized the tactic immediately. Discredit the messenger, and the message dissolves on its own. What unsettled him most was how effective it was. Doors that had always been open began to close. Former colleagues returned calls more slowly, if at all. A few advised him gently to let it go, to enjoy retirement, to focus on his health. Their concern felt rehearsed, protective of him in theory, protective of themselves in practice. Marcus didn't blame them. Institutions train people well. Survival often meant knowing when not to ask questions. Still, the isolation pressed in, a reminder that truth-seeking was rarely a communal activity once it threatened comfort. At night, Marcus replayed the moment of removal again and again, examining it the way he once reviewed crime scenes. The efficiency. The lack of hesitation. Whitmore hadn't raised his voice or caused a scene. He had simply exercised authority, confident that would be obeyed. And it had been. That kind of confidence didn't grow in a vacuum. It was cultivated, reinforced by years of deference. Marcus understood then that this wasn't just about protecting a secret. It was about preserving hierarchy. He had violated an unspoken rule by asking the wrong question in the wrong room. The humiliation lingered, but it didn't weaken him. It clarified his position. He was outside now, and outsiders saw things insiders missed. Free from the constraints of decorum and approval, Marcus could think more sharply. The system had made its move, revealing its priorities. Preservation of image over inquiry. Celebration over accountability. Marcus had spent decades navigating those currents from within. Now he would have to swim against them from the shore. His daughter, once the voice of caution, began to shift. The anger faded, replaced by focus. She had seen the same thing Marcus had, not denial, but control. She helped him document everything, writing down names, times, exact wording. The act itself felt subversive, reclaiming narrative from the forces trying to rewrite it. Marcus knew how easily memory could be contested. Records mattered. Even if no one believed them now, they would matter later. The embarrassment also brought something unexpected, resolve sharpened by loss of illusion. Marcus no longer harbored any hope that this could be resolved quietly or cleanly. The Gala had been a test, and he had failed it in the eyes of those who valued silence. That failure was liberating. There was no reputation left to protect, no professional ladder to climb. What remained was purpose, stripped of ornament. The girl's face behind glass returned to him, steady and unyielding, as if urging him forward rather than back. Marcus thought about how often truth was framed as disruption, how those who insisted on it were labeled troublemakers rather than witnesses. He had played both roles in his life. He knew which one mattered. The humiliation of being removed from the Gala wasn't a setback. It was a warning shot, meant to deter him from going further. Instead, it confirmed that further was the only direction left. As the week wore on, Marcus noticed something else of fear, faint but present, threading through the resistance. It surfaced in the quickness with which security had been summoned, in the coordinated silence afterward, in the careful distancing by those who should have been indifferent. Fear didn't mean panic. It meant vulnerability. Someone had calculated risk and decided Marcus Reed was no longer negligible. That knowledge steadied him more than encouragement ever could. He understood now that he was being watched, assessed, managed. That realization brought with it an old, familiar calm. He had been here before, in other cases where the truth made powerful people uncomfortable. The playbook was the same. Undermine credibility, apply social pressure, isolate, wait for fatigue to do the rest. Marcus had seen it fail too, when persistence outlasted resistance. He intended to be persistent. The Gala was meant to celebrate legacy. Instead, it exposed one. Marcus Reed walked away from that night without applause, without allies, without protection. What he carried with him was heavier and more dangerous, certainty earned at personal cost. The system had shown its hand. And once you see how something defends itself, you learn exactly where to apply pressure. Marcus Reed and his daughter Alina sat in the dim glow of the laptop screen. The room otherwise silent, except for the soft hum of the machine and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. They had been working in tandem for hours, cataloging photographs, cross-referencing dates, and methodically preparing to do what Marcus knew would be the most difficult part of all verification. The wax figure, the one that had haunted his thoughts since the Gala, was no longer just an object of curiosity. It had become a puzzle demanding meticulous attention, a test of patience and precision. Alina adjusted the angle of the camera for a clearer view, ensuring every detail was captured. From the subtle arch of the eyebrows to the tiniest curve of the lips. Marcus leaned closer, squinting, comparing the figure to the photographs of Nia Thompson, the girl who had disappeared 2 decades earlier. Each measurement, each observation, deepened the sense of inevitability. The match was not approximate, it was almost impossible to dismiss. He traced the lines of the wax figure's face with a practiced eye, recalling the countless missing persons cases he had investigated over his career. Faces were complicated, unique, and above all, telling. Every child he had ever searched for had left a mark, however small, in the world and in the people who knew them. Now, staring at the figure, Marcus felt the weight of years of absence collapse into a single, unbearable moment. The shape of the jaw, the distance between eyes, the proportions of the nose and mouth, it all aligned with a precision that left little room for doubt. Alina watched silently, knowing the magnitude of what they were observing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, ready to run the facial recognition software that would quantify the instinct her father trusted implicitly. The software processed the images with a clinical detachment, mapping points on the face of Nia from her school photograph, and aligning them against the wax figure's features. Marcus held his breath as the program compared thousands of data points, analyzing bone structure, proportions, and distinctive features. The numbers appeared on the screen, cold and factual, a 96% match. The probability of coincidence less than 1 in 100,000. Marcus felt a hollow itch in his chest. This wasn't just recognition. This was confirmation of the truth he had feared for years. The girl he had promised to find, the one whose disappearance had haunted him since his early days as a detective, had been right there all along, preserved in wax. He pushed back from the desk, running a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the implications. The figure had been displayed openly at a gala, admired by hundreds, while the family of the missing girl had lived in uncertainty for decades. The audacity of it struck him in a way that made his stomach tighten. Someone had thought they could hide this crime behind legitimacy and elegance, believing that public respect would shield them from scrutiny. Marcus understood, as he always had, that arrogance and overconfidence were dangerous mistakes. The moment of revelation carried with it both horror and a strange sense of clarity. The girl was alive in memory, but had been taken in reality, transformed into a display, her humanity reduced to a model for observation. Alina spoke softly, breaking the silence that had grown heavy around them. She suggested documenting everything meticulously, capturing every angle of the wax figure before it was removed or altered. They had to move quickly. The gala had ended, but the collection would not remain intact for long. Marcus nodded, the resolve in his eyes hardening. He had spent decades learning how fragile evidence could be when power and wealth were involved. Even a single photograph could be challenged, a single witness dismissed, but thorough documentation created layers of protection for truth. Together, they worked efficiently, taking multiple photographs, noting angles, lighting, and all distinguishing characteristics. The task was methodical, almost ritualistic, and yet beneath it ran a current of urgency born of the knowledge that delay could mean loss. As they worked, Marcus reflected on the nature of the confirmation they were about to hold in their hands. This was more than identifying a face. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the suffering of the family, the years of searching, the unanswered questions, were recognized in a tangible, undeniable way. The wax figure had become a symbol, a nexus of truth that demanded acknowledgement. The responsibility Marcus felt was immense. It was not enough to know the truth privately. The world would have to recognize it, and that recognition would not come easily. The power structures that allowed this situation to exist would resist, and Marcus understood that resistance would be formidable. Once the photographs were complete, Alina began the process of running them through professional facial recognition software. Marcus watched the screen, following the mapping points, noting the alignment with an almost clinical fascination. The software aged the original photograph of Naya, projecting what she would have looked like 2 decades later, and compared it to the wax figure. Each point analyzed brought them closer to certainty. The results were unequivocal, the facial structures aligned in nearly every measurable aspect. The distinctive heterochromia, the one brown eye, one hazel, matched perfectly, along with all other identifying features. Marcus felt a weight lift, not because it brought comfort, but because it crystallized the path forward. He thought about the family, the years of waiting and the absence of closure, and felt a profound mixture of sorrow and responsibility. This confirmation meant that the mystery that had defined his career was no longer a mystery. It meant that action was required, that the truth had to be carried forward into a world that had largely ignored it. Marcus understood that their work had to be both thorough and indisputable. They needed a record that could withstand skepticism, scrutiny, and denial. This was not just about finding evidence. It was about creating a foundation for justice. The enormity of the task pressed down on him, yet it also sharpened his focus. Marcus Reed had spent a lifetime investigating missing persons, tracking threads of evidence that often led nowhere. This time, the evidence was not abstracted, it was concrete, visible, undeniable. The wax figure represented both a revelation and a call to action. He felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried him through years of investigation. There would be no shortcuts, no assumptions. Every detail had to be recorded, every angle considered, every comparison verified. Marcus and Alina worked in silence for hours, cataloging, measuring, and verifying until the room was littered with photographs, notes, and printouts. Each piece was another layer of certainty, another shield against the inevitable attempts at denial or obfuscation. By the time they paused, exhaustion had set in, but the clarity of purpose remained. The figure in wax was no longer a symbol of mystery. It was a signal of truth, and Marcus understood that their next steps would determine whether that truth could compel action. The confirmation was not the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning that had been waiting for 20 years. The quiet of the room belied the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Marcus leaned back, eyes closed, thinking of the girl and the family who had searched for her in vain. The photographs, the software, the measurements, they were tools, but the human element, the years of watching, waiting, hoping, and remembering, were what made the evidence meaningful. Marcus felt the convergence of all those years, the weight of experience, and the sharp, unforgiving clarity of the present. The confirmation of identity was complete, and with it came the unshakable understanding that their work was far from over. Outside the room, the city of New Orleans continued its rhythms, indifferent to the revelation that had just occurred. Inside, Marcus and Alina were immersed in the proof, a nexus of logic, memory, and moral obligation. The confirmation was not merely technical. It was moral, ethical, and urgent. They had uncovered a fact that demanded response, and Marcus Reed, carrying the cumulative weight of decades spent seeking truth, understood that the next steps would define not just justice for one girl, but the integrity of all he had ever sought to protect. The room remained dark except for the glow of the laptop and the faint light spilling through the blinds. Marcus and Alina had confirmed the unthinkable, and the confirmation itself carried a kind of inevitability. It was no longer conjecture or theory. It was data, proof, and moral imperative woven into a single undeniable fact. Every calculation, every photograph, every point of comparison had reinforced what Marcus had always known in the gut. The girl had been hidden in plain sight, and the time for action had arrived. The reckoning would begin now, with evidence in hand and certainty in heart, guided by the meticulous work that had brought them to this moment. Marcus Reed's investigation began to coalesce around one name that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Woven into the edges of every lead he had ever pursued: Victor Hale. Hale's presence in Marcus's mind was a constant hum, a signal that had been faintly detectable during his earliest searches, but never fully understood. He was the CEO of Halogen Research, a pharmaceutical company that operated with enough sophistication and influence to make small disasters disappear without notice. Marcus had encountered corporate obfuscation before, but this felt different. Hale's reach was not just procedural, it was personal, interlaced with decades of friendships, favors, and unspoken agreements. The company and its leader seemed untouchable, shielded by a carefully constructed network of respectability and accomplishment. Marcus spent hours poring over public records, news articles, and archived press releases. The company's history was impeccably curated. Positive press about community outreach, medical innovation, and corporate responsibility dominated the record. But beneath the polished surface, Marcus detected gaps. Recruitment campaigns for experimental trials coincided too neatly with reports of student disappearances and unexplained withdrawals. Dates, locations, and subjects aligned in ways that could no longer be ignored. It was a pattern, subtle but unmistakable, like a signature left in the negative spaces of otherwise legitimate activity. Marcus knew he had found the thread, but he had to pull it carefully. One wrong move could trigger defensive measures that would erase everything. He began mapping the connections systematically. Victor Hale had been close friends with Dar. Leonard Wetmore for decades. They shared not just social gatherings but professional collaborations, co-authored papers, board positions in hospitals, and a consistent presence in the medical and academic communities of Louisiana. Marcus noted every event, every mention in society columns, every shared address. It was meticulous work, cataloging decades of proximity and association, searching for the moment where influence crossed into complicity. Each discovery deepened the urgency, each link suggested not just opportunity but alignment of motive, timing, and means. Marcus's daughter, Elena, assisted with the digital cross-referencing. She sifted through online archives, enhancing photographs, extracting metadata, and building timelines with precision. Together, they overlaid the documented dates of Nia Thompson's disappearance with Halogen's recruitment events. The alignment was unsettling. It wasn't just coincidence. The girl had attended a recruitment fair for the trials, been screened, and scheduled for initial participation days before she vanished. Marcus retraced her movements in his mind: the walk across the campus, the interactions with recruiters, the subtle assurances that nothing was dangerous. Everything that had seemed mundane was now ominously significant. Marcus's pulse quickened with the clarity of pattern recognition. The implications were horrifying. Nia had volunteered for a clinical trial out of financial necessity, the kind of desperation Marcus had witnessed countless times among students with few options. The trial had promised compensation, structured protocols, and oversight. In theory, nothing was extraordinary. In practice, Marcus could see how it became a trap. He imagined the facility in Mississippi, sterile and controlled, where the young volunteers entered willingly, unaware of the risks. The coincidence of her disappearance the day after the first screening, combined with the meticulous preservation of her likeness in wax, made it painfully clear that this was not random. Someone had calculated every step. Marcus revisited his early investigations, recalling past cases that now took on a sinister context. Other missing persons reports from surrounding areas bore similarities. Withdrawals from clinical trials, lack of follow-up, vague explanations. He had filed them away at the time as unfortunate anomalies. Now, they were pieces of a larger, grim mosaic. 12 names in total, each disappearing after enrolling in halogen trials, each unaccounted for. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest as he recognized that the wax figure collection mirrored the number of missing persons, each figure representing an actual victim. The precision of this alignment was not happenstance. It was a blueprint of concealment. Marcus thought of Whitmore, his professional reputation unassailable, his collection admired, his character publicly celebrated. And yet, the connection to Hale was undeniable. The two men had not simply been friends, they had been collaborators in a system that blurred ethical lines into non-existence. Marcus considered the audacity required to maintain such a system over decades. The arrogance that assumed no one would scrutinize or survive long enough to connect the dots. It was the kind of hubris that allowed entire patterns of harm to persist under the guise of legitimacy. He also considered the human element. Behind each name, each wax figure, there was a life abruptly ended, a family left with questions that could not be answered. Marcus remembered Denise Thompson and the weight of 20 years of unanswered longing. He understood that uncovering the pattern was not simply an intellectual exercise, it was a moral imperative. Each piece of evidence he cataloged, each correlation he verified, was a step toward acknowledgement and justice for those who had been rendered invisible by power and wealth. Every call he made, every archive he scoured, revealed the meticulous care taken by Hale and his associates to ensure plausible deniability. Records were incomplete, files sanitized, public-facing documentation immaculate. Marcus recognized the sophistication of the deception. This was not the work of amateurs. It was carefully orchestrated, with redundancies and shields built into every conceivable angle. And yet, no matter how sophisticated, there were gaps. Marcus found them in small inconsistencies, dates that didn't quite line up, secondary sources that contradicted primary narratives, subtle patterns of language that betrayed corporate precision but not truth. Each gap became a foothold for investigation. The process of connecting Hale to the disappearance of Nia Thompson demanded patience. Marcus could not confront him directly without risk, not yet. Evidence had to be concrete, undeniable. There could be no accusations based on speculation. Each discovery had to be cataloged, documented, and verified. The meticulous cross-referencing with photographs, trial records, press releases, and historical data became a daily ritual. Marcus tracked every recruitment event, every clinical trial announcement, every mention of student participation, and cross-checked them against missing persons reports. The overlap was overwhelming. As he worked, Marcus realized the psychological weight of the investigation was immense. He carried the cumulative responsibility for the past 20 years, the moral obligation to the living and the dead, and the pressing urgency of acting before potential evidence could be destroyed or hidden further. This was not just a puzzle, it was a confrontation with an entire structure built to protect wrongs. Marcus understood that he and Alina had to move with precision, as any misstep could alert Hale and Whitmore to their progress. And the consequences would be severe. In the quiet hours of the night, Marcus reviewed the timeline repeatedly, testing it against every known detail. He examined photographs of recruitment fairs, cross-referencing faces in the background, the presence of identifiable staff, subtle changes in signage. He noted the timing of absences and withdrawals, piecing together a story that had been deliberately obscured by decades of careful construction. The more he uncovered, the more audacious the scale of the concealment appeared. Each connection strengthened his resolve. This was not just about Nia Thompson. It was about dismantling a pattern, exposing the mechanisms that had allowed these disappearances to persist unchecked. By the time the sun rose over New Orleans, Marcus had a clearer understanding of the scope of what he was up against. Hale was more than a single actor. He was the node in a network of influence and deception, capable of controlling perception and suppressing scrutiny. Whitmore, with his public accolades and carefully curated collection, was a facilitator, a custodian of concealment. Marcus realized that confronting them would require both patience and courage, and that the truth, once fully revealed, would have to be presented in a manner that could not be ignored. Sitting back in his chair, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. The connections were undeniable, the evidence compelling, the moral imperative clear. Nia Thompson's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a deliberate act intertwined with systemic concealment and exploitation. The discovery of the wax figure had been only the beginning. Uncovering Hale's role and the broader implications of his network was the next step. Marcus understood that the work ahead would be long, dangerous, and relentless, but also necessary. He felt the familiar surge of determination, sharpened by knowledge, burdened by responsibility, and propelled by a lifetime of chasing justice. This was the point of no return. The investigation had reached a critical junction, and Marcus Reed, finally seeing the architecture of the crime, knew that he could not, and would not, turn away. Marcus Reed's mind was a storm of dates, names, and locations as he traced the path of Nia Thompson's last known movements. Every detail mattered: the campus she had walked, the building where she had been last seen, the experimental trial recruitment table she had approached without suspicion. It had been the summer of 1996, a season of heat and humidity that blurred faces in crowds and left footprints on sidewalks that quickly disappeared. Marcus reconstructed the scene in his mind with painstaking accuracy, imagining Nia stepping across the campus green, greeting acquaintances, glancing at her watch, unaware that each step was leading her toward a meticulously orchestrated trap. He found the advertisements for the halogen clinical trial buried in old university archives, yellowed notices tucked between student announcements and club postings. The language was persuasive but benign, promising compensation for participation, structured schedules, and professional oversight. On the surface, nothing seemed alarming, but Marcus knew better. He understood how authority and legitimacy could be wielded as tools to manipulate the vulnerable. Nia, like so many students, was driven by need: tuition, books, expenses. The offer had seemed reasonable, even beneficial. Marcus felt the weight of her trust pressing down on him, decades after the fact. He traced the timeline of the clinical trial meticulously. Nia had attended the initial screening in early August, met with staff who wore professional uniforms, signed forms filled with jargon she likely didn't fully understand. She had left the campus thinking the trial was a small, controlled commitment. 2 days later, she vanished. The abruptness of her disappearance, juxtaposed with the mundane nature of her initial participation, made the situation almost surreal. Marcus noted every discrepancy in records, every gap left by administrative oversights or deliberate omissions. It was as if someone had constructed the perfect pathway to concealment, with all deviations accounted for and minimized. Marcus also examined the recruitment fairs themselves. He discovered photos of the events, scanned from local newspapers and campus newsletters. Students clustered around tables, pamphlets in hand, expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Marcus enlarged the images, enhancing details, and there she was, Nia Thompson, her dark hair curling around her shoulders. The same face he had memorized from countless photographs. The confirmation that she had indeed attended these events prior to her disappearance was a breakthrough. Every other lead he had previously pursued now aligned with this singular pivot point: the clinical trial. He spent hours cross-referencing the trial dates with missing persons reports. Patterns began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. Other participants listed as withdrawn, or having left for personal reasons, coincided with later reports of disappearances. Names, dates, and locations overlapped in ways that could no longer be ignored. Marcus documented each connection carefully, aware that the strength of his case depended on meticulous accuracy. One false assumption could unravel everything. The evidence had to be airtight before any confrontation could take place. The more Marcus delved into the details, the more he understood the mechanics of the deception. The trial was legitimate in its exterior appearance, with contracts, informed consent forms, and procedural safeguards. But the internal reality was something entirely different. Participants were monitored selectively, data collected for purposes that were never disclosed, and oversight was minimal at best. The system was designed to produce results, while protecting those at the top from accountability. Marcus traced the chain of command, identifying the individuals with authority to manipulate records and control information. Every connection led inexorably back to Victor Hale. Marcus also considered the human factors. He thought about how Nia's sense of normalcy had been exploited. The signage, the staff interactions, the procedural steps, all designed to convey safety and reliability. He imagined her initial skepticism being assuaged, her trust earned by appearances, reinforced by credentials. And then he imagined the moment she realized the situation was dangerous, or worse, that she would never be allowed to leave on her own terms. The horror of that realization struck him with fresh intensity. It was a cruelty that relied on patience, strategy, and control rather than brute force. He reconstructed the route she would have taken from the campus to the halogen facility. Every street corner, every shortcut, every window and entrance became significant. Marcus considered how few witnesses there would have been, how natural it would have appeared if someone had simply vanished without notice. The precision of the operation, combined with the use of legitimate-looking structures and schedules, created a near-perfect cover. It was a chilling reminder of how easily trust could be weaponized against the unsuspecting. Marcus documented every detail with Alina's assistance, noting times, distances, and likely interactions. They cross-checked student enrollment records, attendance sheets, and photographs to establish a clear picture of Naya's activities leading up to her disappearance. Every confirmation increased the urgency of their next steps. This was no longer just about piecing together the past. The meticulous reconstruction had revealed a pattern that demanded action, a sequence of events that, once understood, could implicate those responsible. He also analyzed administrative responses after Naya's disappearance. The delay in reporting, the incomplete follow-up, and the polite dismissal of inquiries painted a picture of institutional complicity. Marcus realized that the trial's internal documentation had been crafted to protect the organization, to ensure plausible deniability. Each administrative decision was another layer of protection, another barrier between truth and discovery. Understanding this was critical. It showed him not only what had happened to Naya, but how the mechanisms of concealment had been maintained over time. Marcus reviewed the photographs and records repeatedly, piecing together interactions, timing, and movements with mathematical precision. He annotated every detail, creating a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. He knew that confronting Victor Hale and the associated individuals would require more than intuition or emotion. The case needed to be structured, documented, and presented in a way that would compel acknowledgement. It was painstaking work, exhausting in its demand for absolute accuracy, but it was necessary. Every detail he preserved was another safeguard for the truth. By the end of the day, Marcus had a comprehensive understanding of the circumstances surrounding Naya Thompson's disappearance. He had traced her movements from campus to the trial, cross-referenced all available records, and documented the gaps left by the organization. The evidence formed a coherent timeline, demonstrating that her disappearance was not an accident, not an anomaly, but a calculated event facilitated by systemic oversight and individual decisions. Marcus felt the gravity of this clarity weighing on him. It was both confirmation and responsibility. He now knew with certainty that Naya's disappearance was directly linked to the halogen trial, and the meticulous reconstruction left him with no room for doubt. He looked at Alina, fatigue etched into her features but determination in her eyes. They had achieved something significant, a clear, documented pathway from recruitment to disappearance. It was the evidence they needed to move forward. The recognition of this pathway crystallized Marcus's understanding of the stakes. Naya had not wandered into the unknown by chance. Every step of her journey had been guided, monitored, and manipulated, leaving behind a trail that only someone willing to dig meticulously could uncover. Marcus Reed understood that uncovering this truth was the first step toward justice, and that the next steps would require the same relentless precision, courage, and patience that had brought him to this point. Marcus Reed's focus shifted as he began to consider the broader implications of the halogen trials. Naya Thompson's disappearance had been a terrifying anomaly on its own, but as he dug deeper, it became clear that she was not the only one. Other students who had participated in similar trials had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. At first, he had hesitated to draw connections, aware of the danger of seeing patterns where none existed. But the coincidences were too numerous to ignore. Each case mirrored the next. A young volunteer, eager and unsuspecting, approached by authoritative figures in controlled environments, only to disappear shortly thereafter. It was methodical, almost ritualistic, and Marcus felt the weight of its cold efficiency pressing down on him. He revisited old files and police reports, some archived in dusty boxes, others in digital formats collected over the years. Names, dates, and locations began to align in a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. Each disappearance corresponded with a trial event, a screening session, or a recruitment drive. Marcus could see the orchestration in retrospect, the careful planning that had allowed those in power to exploit vulnerability with impunity. It was a network of manipulation, where the veneer of legitimacy protected the guilty, and the innocent were systematically erased. The realization filled him with a grim determination. He had to document everything meticulously before anyone could alter the evidence or hide the trail. Elena helped him compile the data into timelines, cross-referencing attendance sheets, campus photographs, and press releases from the period. They created maps linking each student's movements to trial schedules and recruitment events. Each alignment was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that these weren't isolated incidents but part of a deliberate scheme. Marcus noticed subtle consistencies: the way participants were escorted, the forms they signed, the personnel overseeing each session. All had been designed to project safety, professionalism, and authority while hiding the underlying danger. He felt a mounting sense of urgency. Time had passed since the first disappearance, and with it, memories faded, records were lost, and witnesses aged or relocated. Marcus knew he had to act decisively before the trail grew too cold to follow. He examined the organizational structure of Halogen Research, noting who had authority over each trial, who maintained oversight, and who could manipulate records. Every connection he documented added to a web of accountability that had been obscured for decades. He was building a map of influence and opportunity, understanding exactly where responsibility lay and how it had been shielded. The more Marcus explored, the more the scale of the operation shocked him. Each participant, each disappearance was carefully logged, and yet the public record painted only a picture of success and innovation. Marcus realized that the very systems meant to protect participants had been weaponized against them. He imagined the fear and confusion the students must have felt, unaware that the people guiding them were orchestrating a plan to erase them. The thought of their innocence exploited in such a systematic way ignited a fury in him, one tempered by the patience honed from years of investigative work. He began considering the legal and moral frameworks that had been violated. Informed consent had been manipulated, oversight protocols ignored, and reporting structures intentionally left ambiguous. Marcus saw the trial schedules as more than administrative tools. They were instruments of concealment. Each student's disappearance had been facilitated by layers of bureaucracy, disguising crime as procedure. The careful alignment of these elements was a testament to both ingenuity and moral depravity, a reminder that authority can be corrupted with devastating efficiency when unchecked. Marcus reviewed witness statements, some previously dismissed, with renewed attention. Casual observations about participants' behavior, minor inconsistencies in attendance, and overlooked notes about missing students now revealed a consistent narrative. Every anomaly fit within a larger pattern. Marcus's experience told him that few would see it unless they knew where to look, unless they connected the procedural dots with human consequence. The pieces were in place. It was only a matter of meticulous examination to reveal the truth fully. Elena continued to assist him, inputting data into analytical programs that highlighted correlations he might have missed. The software generated timelines that visualized overlaps between recruitment events and student absences, creating an irrefutable sequence of events. Marcus found himself haunted by the clarity of these visualizations. Each line, each plotted point, told a story of opportunity exploited and love stolen. He realized that the wax figures, preserved meticulously in Whitmore's collection, were the final manifestation of the same system, a system that removed humanity and replaced it with a curated image, neatly cataloged and admired without consequence. Marcus's determination hardened. He understood that uncovering the truth would require more than documentation. He needed to anticipate resistance from those with power, as well as the subtle ways that narratives could be shaped to obscure facts. The pattern of disappearances was too deliberate to be ignored, and the responsibility to expose it weighed heavily on him. Each connection he drew, each correlation confirmed, brought him closer to a confrontation that would be inevitable and dangerous. He thought about the families left behind, the questions that had lingered unanswered for decades. Denise Thompson and others like her had waited, hoping against hope for news of their children. Marcus understood that exposing the system was not just an academic exercise. It was a moral obligation to restore dignity, recognition, and closure to those who had been deprived of it. The weight of these responsibilities added urgency to every action he took, every document he examined, every connection he verified. As he continued mapping out the 12 cases, Marcus realized that the operation's scope extended beyond what he had initially imagined. The meticulous preservation of victims, the careful documentation of trial events, and the deliberate concealment of anomalies all pointed to a coordinated strategy to erase individuals while maintaining an appearance of legitimacy. This realization intensified his focus. The work had to be flawless, every detail mattered. Any oversight could jeopardize the exposure of the system. By the time the sun rose over New Orleans, Marcus had reconstructed the sequence of events for each participant. He could see the pattern, clear and unyielding: the recruitment, the monitoring, the disappearances, and the final act of preservation. Each case was a reflection of the others, a calculated step in a broader scheme. Marcus and Alina compiled the data into comprehensive timelines, photographic evidence, and cross-reference notes. They had built a foundation robust enough to withstand scrutiny and challenge. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing against him, but clarity burning bright. The evidence was indisputable. The halogen trials were directly connected to the disappearance of 12 young volunteers, including Nia Thompson. Each piece of documentation, every corroborated detail, was a step toward exposing the truth. Marcus understood the stakes. They were no longer chasing a single cold casa. They were uncovering a network of systemic exploitation, deliberate concealment, and moral corruption. The work was far from over. He knew that confirming the pattern was only the beginning. The evidence had to be presented carefully, strategically, to ensure it could not be dismissed or manipulated. Marcus felt the familiar resolve settle in his chest, the same determination that had carried him through decades of investigations, disappointments, and danger. The path forward would be long, meticulous, and fraught with risk, but the truth demanded it. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus felt that the culmination of his efforts might finally bring justice, recognition, and closure to those who had been erased from the world so callously. Marcus Reed began to feel the pressure in a way he hadn't anticipated. The phone calls started subtly at first, missed calls from unknown numbers, brief silences when he answered. The faintest clicks at the end of the line. It was almost imperceptible, but he recognized the language instantly. Someone was watching, assessing, testing. The weight of years of investigative experience told him these were not idle pranks. These were warnings. He considered the implications carefully, knowing that any overreaction could expose him and his daughter, Elena, to danger. The people behind the disappearance and preservation of Nia Thompson were methodical, disciplined, and confident. They had built a network of authority and protection, and now they were measuring him to see how much pressure that they could apply before he faltered. Elena noticed it too, the subtle changes in their routines. Marcus had always been meticulous, but he began double-checking doors, windows, and locks. He changed routines, drove different routes, and monitored email and social media activity with a newfound intensity. She asked why he didn't call the police immediately, and Marcus explained calmly that involving official channels too soon could alert the wrong people, allowing them to erase or manipulate evidence. He had learned through decades of law enforcement that timing was everything. Evidence could vanish in hours if the wrong individuals caught wind of an investigation that threatened their control. As the days passed, the warnings grew bolder. One evening, Marcus returned home to find a note slipped under the door, a simple message, typed and precise, that read only, "Stop digging." There was no signature, no hint of identity, just the weight of authority behind it. Marcus held the note carefully, knowing it represented both acknowledgement and threat. Whoever had sent it understood his methods. They knew he would not back down. The note was intended to intimidate, to instill fear, but it also confirmed the significance of what he was uncovering. This was not a small-scale crime, this was an operation large and dangerous enough to require silence enforced through intimidation. He considered the risks to his daughter as he held the note in his hand. Elena had been involved from the beginning, assisting with research, cataloging, and verification. She had unwittingly become part of a complex and dangerous investigation. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. Protecting her became a paramount concern, and he adjusted their routines accordingly. He instructed her to be cautious in her communications, to avoid sharing details, and to trust only him. The awareness of potential danger sharpened both their focus and their resolve. Marcus also reviewed the evidence they had already gathered. The wax figure, the timelines, the photographic documentation, and the connections to halogen research were secure. He knew that their work had to be meticulous. Any mistake could be exploited by those who saw it to maintain control. The knowledge of being observed heightened his attention to detail. Every call, every note, every email became a potential clue, a possible vector for manipulation or a warning. Marcus's mind worked constantly, mapping possibilities, anticipating moves, and preparing contingencies. At night, he often sat in his study, lights dimmed, reviewing every interaction and every piece of evidence. He thought about the psychology of the individuals who were attempting to intimidate him. They were confident, patient, and deliberate. They understood that fear could be a tool to slow investigation, to create doubt and hesitation. Marcus reflected on his years as a detective, recalling cases in which criminals used similar tactics. He had learned to recognize the signs, to separate intimidation from reality, and to continue methodically despite threats. This awareness steeled him, making him more cautious but not deterred. The escalation of warnings also forced Marcus to consider the broader implications of their findings. Halogen research was not merely a corporate entity, it was a nexus of power, influence, and control. The individuals responsible had anticipated scrutiny and had systems in place to manage it. Marcus realized that they would not stop until they were either exposed publicly or felt fully secure again. Every threat, every subtle warning, reinforced the stakes. He understood that they were up against individuals who had long experience in manipulating environments and people to protect their interests. Despite the threats, Marcus refused to back down. The warnings, instead of deterring him, clarified his purpose. He knew that continuing the investigation was not just about uncovering Nia Thompson's fate, it was about preventing further exploitation and ensuring accountability. The calculated intimidation only confirmed the significance of their discoveries. Marcus and Elena began developing contingency plans, considering secure methods to store evidence, communicate, and continue research without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. They became increasingly strategic, operating with heightened awareness of potential surveillance. Marcus also reflected on the moral weight of their work. Each warning, each attempt at intimidation, was a reminder of the stake as human lives had been destroyed, families left in uncertainty, and the perpetrators had become adept at hiding behind layers of legitimacy. The responsibility he carried now extended beyond personal or professional obligations. It was a duty to truth, justice, and the preservation of human dignity. The pressure of the threats sharpened his commitment, reminding him that hesitation could have far-reaching consequences. He found that the threats, while unsettling, also served as a lens through which he could evaluate the intentions and capabilities of those involved. The precision, timing, and subtlety of the warnings indicated a level of organization and planning that mirrored the original crimes. Marcus used this insight to anticipate potential moves, adjust strategies, and protect both evidence and those assisting him. Each interaction, whether direct or indirect, became data to be analyzed, a reflection of the mindset behind the operation. In the quiet moments, Marcus often returned to the note slipped under his door. It was a stark reminder of the tangible consequences of pursuing truth against powerful interests. Yet, paradoxically, it also reinforced the certainty that their investigation was on the right path. Those who felt the need to intimidate did so because what Marcus and Elena were uncovering was real, threatening, and significant. The warnings had transformed into evidence themselves, indicators of the importance and danger of the revelations they were pursuing. Through the increasing tension and looming threats, Marcus and Elena adjusted to a new rhythm. Their focus sharpened, their diligence intensified, and their strategic planning became more comprehensive. Marcus knew that the coming weeks would demand the same patience, precision, and courage that had guided him throughout his career. The warnings had underscored the stakes, but they had also provided clarity. Marcus understood that the only way forward was careful persistence, unwavering attention to detail, and a readiness to confront the power structures that had orchestrated and concealed the crimes for decades. By the end of the chapter, Marcus Reed had transformed the fear induced by the warnings into determination. Each threat became a measure of the significance of his investigation, each missed call or ominous note a confirmation that he was on the right path. He and Elena had prepared themselves to continue despite the intimidation, understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with purpose in its presence. They would proceed with vigilance, patience, and unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth and ensuring justice for Nia Thompson and the other victims. Marcus Reed had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. Every piece of evidence, every correlation, every timeline painstakingly reconstructed pointed to one uncomfortable truth. Dr. Leonard Whitmore was directly involved in the preservation of Nia Thompson and the other missing students. Marcus understood that confronting him would be dangerous, yet necessary. He had spent decades building the skills to face individuals who wielded authority as a shield, and this confrontation would demand all of his experience, patience, and insight. The task was not simply to accuse, but to dismantle the layers of deception that had allowed Whitmore to maintain a facade of benevolence for decades. Marcus arranged a meeting under the pretense of a professional inquiry. He needed Whitmore to talk, to reveal through speech and gesture what could not be uncovered in documents alone. As he entered the office, the weight of past failures and decades of unresolved cases pressed down on him. Whitmore greeted him warmly, with the practiced charm of a man used to admiration and respect. Marcus noted every detail: the firmness of his handshake, the calm tone, the slight pause before answering questions. Each subtle movement was a signal, a data point revealing confidence, discomfort, or deceit. The conversation began innocuously, as Marcus had planned. He asked Whitmore about the origins of the wax figure collection, the acquisition process, and historical documentation. Whitmore answered smoothly, detailing the provenance, the careful preservation techniques, and the educational purpose of the collection. Marcus listened carefully, noting inconsistencies in dates, subtle omissions, and the way Whitmore's eyes flickered when certain topics were mentioned. Every measured answer, every polished statement served both to inform and to protect. Marcus's questions grew gradually more pointed, designed to elicit reactions without triggering defensive hostility too early. He mentioned Nia Thompson by name, speaking in calm, factual terms about her disappearance and the circumstances surrounding the halogen trials. Whitmore's expression remained composed, but Marcus noticed a subtle tightening around the mouth, a micro movement in his brow, a brief hesitation that spoke volumes. The evidence was undeniable, and Marcus could see Whitmore calculating the risk of each admission. The doctor's composure was strong, but the smallest cracks revealed the underlying truth. Marcus pressed carefully, weaving questions about procedural documentation and participant records into the conversation. Whitmore attempted to redirect, emphasizing the educational and historical value of the wax figures, the rarity of the models, and the significance for medical students. Marcus countered with timelines, photographs, and verified records. Each factual reference narrowed the space in which Whitmore could maneuver. Marcus observed the shift in body language, the way Whitmore's shoulders stiffened, The subtle avoidance of eye contact when confronted with dates and evidence that could not be easily explained away. At one point, Marcus leaned forward, voice steady but firm, and asked about the discrepancies between participant records and public reporting. The students listed as withdrawn but never accounted for, and the uncanny alignment with the wax figures. Whitmore's initial reaction was a deflection, referencing administrative oversight and archival errors. Marcus noted the repetition, the precise wording, and the emphasis on lost records. These were standard techniques used to deflect accountability. He remained calm, guiding the conversation without escalating into confrontation, knowing that patience was his most powerful tool. As the discussion continued, Marcus shifted from inquiry to implication, layering questions to expose the operational decisions behind the concealment. He spoke about patterns, documented timelines, and cross-referenced events. Each statement designed to force Whitmore to acknowledge connections without having to state them directly. The doctor's carefully maintained demeanor began to strain under the weight of undeniable facts. Marcus observed microexpressions, the brief tightening of the jaw, the fleeting glance away, the way Whitmore's hands shifted subtly on the desk. Every detail confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Whitmore was protecting not only the collection, but also the truth behind it. Marcus then presented corroborating evidence linking Whitmore to halogen research, emphasizing the procedural decisions, oversight lapses, and shared communications that demonstrated coordinated responsibility. Whitmore's responses became more measured, cautious, and deliberate. He attempted to frame the discussion around professional ethics and the limits of memory, but Marcus persisted, keeping the focus on verifiable facts. He watched as Whitmore struggled to reconcile the narrative he had maintained publicly with the mounting evidence Marcus laid before him. The turning point came when Marcus, quietly but firmly, referenced the preservation methods used on the wax figures, the alignment with missing student cases, and the chronological overlap with halogen trials. Whitmore paused, and for the first time, his polished exterior showed strain. Marcus could see him calculating, weighing the consequences of admission versus continued denial. The pause was telling. Marcus recognized it as the moment where truth became unavoidable, where silence was no longer a viable shield. Marcus continued methodically, presenting connections, timelines, and corroborated data that left little room for misinterpretation. Whitmore attempted one last diversion, referencing the historical significance of anatomical models and the educational mission. But Marcus countered with the unassailable facts: participant records, missing persons reports, and photographic evidence. The doctor's deflection faltered under the cumulative weight of meticulously presented information. Every point Marcus made was supported by data, every implication grounded in verifiable reality. By the end of the meeting, Whitmore's composure was intact but fragile. He no longer attempted to deny the evidence directly, instead resorting to carefully worded statements that acknowledged procedural anomalies without accepting moral responsibility. Marcus had achieved his objective. He had forced the truth into the open, even if partially veiled, and had exposed the operational and ethical failures that had allowed these crimes to persist. Whitmore's subtle concessions, combined with Marcus's meticulous documentation, created a foundation strong enough for law enforcement action and legal accountability. Marcus left the office with a mix of relief and determination. The confrontation had been precise, strategic, and successful in revealing the depth of Whitmore's involvement. It had required patience, observation, and an understanding of human behavior honed over decades. The encounter confirmed the operational framework that had enabled the concealment of Nia Thompson and the other missing students and provided a roadmap for the next steps in ensuring accountability. Marcus understood that while the confrontation was a milestone, the work was far from complete. The evidence he had gathered, the admissions extracted, and the patterns confirmed would now guide the investigation towards systemic exposure and justice for the victims. In reflection, Marcus considered the broader implications of the confrontation. The meticulous approach had allowed him to extract information, without triggering defensive hostility that might have destroyed the opportunity for truth. Each microexpression, each hesitation, each subtle reaction had been a clue in itself. The confrontation was not about anger or accusation, but about uncovering the operational reality that had enabled systemic exploitation. Marcus recognized that this strategic patience, combined with evidence-based questioning, was essential to dismantling a network protected by authority, reputation, and time. The encounter also reinforced the importance of documentation and verification. Marcus knew that Whitmore would attempt to influence narrative, to maintain a veneer of legitimacy. The records, photographs, and corroborated timelines established during the meeting ensured that any attempt at revisionism could be countered. Marcus had transformed suspicion into documented fact, speculation into verifiable truth. It was a culmination of decades of investigative rigor, applied to a case that demanded precision and moral clarity. Marcus left the confrontation with renewed focus and determination. The path forward involved law enforcement coordination, continued collection of corroborating evidence, and preparation for potential resistance from powerful individuals invested in maintaining secrecy. The confrontation with Whitmore had clarified both the stakes and the methods required to achieve justice. Marcus understood that patience, strategy, and relentless attention to detail were essential for success. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also the clarity that comes when truth is finally acknowledged, even if partially. The meeting marked a turning point. Marcus had forced a key player to reveal both knowledge and subtle admissions without a single overt accusation. He understood that subsequent steps would involve verification, legal consultation, and strategic planning, all grounded in the meticulously documented evidence from the confrontation. Whitmore's behavior had provided critical insight into the mechanisms of concealment, the operational structure of the crimes, and the ways in which authority had been leveraged to maintain secrecy. Marcus was prepared to act, knowing that the confrontation had laid the groundwork for a broader reckoning. Marcus Reed had reached the stage of the investigation where the abstract horror of what had happened to Nia Thompson became tangible in ways that demanded physical evidence and corroboration. The discoveries he and his daughter Alina had compiled, photographs, timelines, and digital cross-references, were no longer simply data points. They were keys to exposing a systematic exploitation that had spanned decades. With Whitmore confronted and the pattern of the Halogen trials firmly documented, Marcus turned his attention to uncovering the hidden infrastructure that had enabled the disappearances and preservation of the victims. He knew this meant moving beyond inference and into the realm of concrete discovery archives, private facilities, and secure storage spaces where evidence might have been kept intentionally or overlooked due to negligence. The first lead came from financial records Marcus had meticulously compiled over weeks, mapping donations, acquisitions, and corporate partnerships tied to Halogen and Whitmore's private collections. Patterns emerged showing unusual allocations of funds for research equipment and educational acquisitions at locations that, on the surface, seemed innocuous. Marcus cross-referenced these with satellite imagery, local building permits, and city records, piecing together the probability that these addresses were not just storage facilities for medical artifacts but repositories for something far more disturbing. Each discovery reinforced the narrative they had been constructing over months, transforming suspicion into actionable insight. Marcus and Elena approached their first physical site cautiously. It was a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans, its exterior blending into a row of older industrial buildings. Marcus had spent his career training for situations where appearances masked danger, and he applied that experience meticulously. They observed the building for hours, noting traffic patterns, delivery schedules, and security presence. The attention to detail was painstaking, but Marcus knew that any misstep could result in evidence being destroyed or lives endangered. As they cataloged every movement, Alina quietly documented their observations, capturing timestamps, vehicle information, and personnel behavior. Once they were confident in their reconnaissance, Marcus arranged for official access under the guise of archival research, leveraging contacts in law enforcement and regulatory agencies who understood the stakes. The warehouse, once inside, revealed more than boxes of ordinary records or medical paraphernalia. There were carefully labeled crates, climate-controlled storage units, and meticulously maintained documentation that suggested the presence of delicate biological materials. Marcus's stomach tightened as he realized the precision and care invested in maintaining these materials. It mirrored the meticulous preservation seen in Whitmore's wax figures. The alignment of storage, documentation, and condition was deliberate, methodical, and chilling. Over the next several days, Marcus and a small team of trusted investigators cataloged the contents of the facility. Every crate, box, and storage unit was opened, examined, and cross-referenced with the timelines and identities of the missing participants. DA samples, medical records, and preserved anatomical specimens emerged, confirming what Marcus had feared. The victims had been methodically preserved, and the documentation suggested that this was a recurring practice rather than an anomaly. Each discovery added weight to the narrative, transforming conjecture into undeniable fact. Throughout the process, Marcus maintained meticulous records, photographing, scanning, and cataloging every piece of evidence. He understood that the strength of their case depended not only on uncovering the truth, but also on ensuring that it could withstand scrutiny from both the legal system and the public. Each piece of evidence was another brick in the structure of accountability, reinforcing the connection between Whitmore, Halligan, and the orchestrated disappearances. Elena's skills in digital analysis proved invaluable, allowing them to cross-reference samples, historical records, and photographic evidence efficiently and accurately. The scale of the operation became increasingly apparent. It was not just a single individual acting alone. It was a coordinated network with institutional knowledge, resources, and protection. Marcus traced communications between Whitmore and Hale, uncovering directives, memos, and emails that revealed coordination in recruitment, monitoring, and preservation of participants. The pattern was both horrifying and meticulous. Marcus recognized that what they were documenting could constitute decades of organized criminal activity, hidden under layers of legitimacy and academic respectability. Marcus also considered the human element of their findings. The preservation of the victims, once abstract in theory, now carried a visceral weight. These had been living people removed from the world and converted into objects for study, display, and control. Each specimen represented not just an individual life but a cascade of grief and unresolved trauma for families left in uncertainty. Marcus reflected on Denise Thompson and the anguish she had endured, imagining the impact of finally revealing the truth. The weight of responsibility for these discoveries pressed heavily on him, reinforcing the necessity of precision, patience, and care. The investigation led Marcus to further facilities and storage locations, each revealing additional evidence that solidified the scope of the crimes. Climate-controlled laboratories, meticulously labeled storage rooms, and cryptic internal records all pointed to a highly organized operation that had been maintained with deliberate oversight and secrecy. Marcus documented inconsistencies in official records, deliberate gaps in regulatory filings, and subtle indications of misappropriated funds. The evidence painted a picture of systematic concealment, reflecting both professional expertise and moral corruption. Marcus and Alina encountered obstacles in accessing certain areas, from security protocols to administrative hurdles. Each challenge was met with strategy and caution. Marcus relied on his decades of experience navigating institutional bureaucracy, leveraging legal channels, and identifying weaknesses in procedural enforcement. Every obstacle overcome revealed more about the lengths to which those responsible had gone to protect themselves. The interplay between authority, secrecy, and deception became increasingly clear, and Marcus recognized the importance of patience in documenting it all. As the investigation progressed, Marcus reflected on the larger implications. The facility contents, records, and documented procedures provided undeniable confirmation of the crimes. But they also revealed a methodology, how participants were recruited, monitored, and ultimately preserved. This systemization indicated not just a single act of malfeasance, but a pattern repeated across multiple cases. Marcus understood that exposing this methodology was critical for preventing future exploitation and ensuring that justice could be pursued. The culmination of their efforts came when Marcus and Ialina linked the preserved specimens directly to the missing students. DNA verification, cross-reference timelines, and corroborating documentation established beyond doubt the identities of the victims. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth could finally be confronted. Sorrow at the deliberate and prolonged suffering endured by the victims and their families. The confirmation was both vindication and indictment, a duality that weighed heavily on him. By the end of their investigation, Marcus had compiled an extensive dossier, photographic evidence, verified DNA results, archival records, and cross-reference communications. The documentation was exhaustive, leaving no room for ambiguity or denial. The scope of the operation, the precision of its execution, and the deliberate concealment of human lives were undeniable. Marcus understood that these records would form the foundation for law enforcement action, legal proceedings, and public accountability. Marcus reflected on the journey from suspicion to confirmation, from abstract horror to tangible evidence. The confrontation with Whitmore had been only the first step. The discovery of the facilities, the preserved specimens, and the meticulous documentation had transformed the investigation into a comprehensive expose of systemic wrongdoing. Marcus understood that the work ahead would be challenging, fraught with legal and logistical complexities. But he also knew that the truth was finally within reach. The culmination of their meticulous efforts provided not only clarity, but also the moral imperative to pursue justice fully, ensuring recognition, accountability, and closure for the victims and their families. Marcus Reed felt the weight of decades pressing down as the investigation reached its culmination. After methodically uncovering evidence confronting Whitmore, tracing Halogen's operations, and verifying the identities of the victims, the final steps involved coordinating with law enforcement to ensure the perpetrators faced justice. Whitmore had been arrested and charged after the evidence had been thoroughly documented and corroborated. The procedural rigor that Marcus had applied ensured the case could not be dismissed on technicalities or lack of proof. Whitmore's demeanor in custody was markedly different from the polished composure he had maintained in their meeting. Arrested, stripped of public respect, the gravity of his actions began to settle visibly, even as he remained somewhat detached, relying on legal counsel to navigate the immediate consequences. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, drawing attention from multiple agencies. Marcus worked closely with prosecutors, providing testimony and detailed reports of his investigation. The meticulous documentation he and Alina had compiled became central to the prosecution, illustrating not only individual wrongdoing but also the systemic failures that had allowed these crimes to persist. Courtrooms, often dry and procedural, became arenas for exposing decades of deception. Each piece of evidence, every timeline, and cross-reference document reinforced the narrative that had long remained hidden, transforming a story of lost lives into a comprehensive account of calculated exploitation and concealment. Marcus paid particular attention to the impact on the families of the victims. He coordinated meetings with Denise Thompson and others, carefully presenting verified information to restore their knowledge of the truth. While the revelations were painful, they also provided closure that had been denied for decades. Seeing the acknowledgement in the family's eyes, Marcus felt the culmination of his professional and personal commitment to justice. This was more than an investigation, it was a restoration of dignity to those who had been silenced and ignored. The emotional weight of the work was immense, but the sense of moral duty carried him forward. Victor Hale remained at large, having fled the country before authorities could apprehend him. Marcus recognized the limitations of law enforcement jurisdiction and understood that not all perpetrators could be held accountable immediately. Nevertheless, the exposure of Halogen's practices and the thorough documentation of evidence served as a foundation for international pursuit and legal pressure. Marcus documented every correspondence, financial record, and corporate link to ensure that future proceedings would be actionable. The knowledge that some individuals might escape immediate justice was tempered by the certainty that their crimes could not remain hidden forever. Marcus reflected on the systemic implications of the case. The exposure of organized concealment, deliberate preservation of victims, and the manipulation of institutional authority sparked broader discussions in the medical and legal communities. Policies were revisited, and regulatory frameworks strengthened to prevent similar abuses. The investigation prompted internal audits of clinical trial procedures, stricter oversight protocols, and legislative measures to protect participants in experimental research. Marcus recognized that the case, while tragic, had catalyzed changes that could save lives in the future, turning a story of horror into one of meaningful reform. Throughout the legal proceedings, Marcus maintained correspondence with Elena, ensuring the accuracy of testimony and documentation. Their partnership, honed through countless hours of research and analysis, proved invaluable. Elena's contributions, from digital analysis to timeline construction, were acknowledged formally, highlighting the importance of meticulous work and cross-generational collaboration. Marcus took pride in her professionalism and attention to detail, recognizing that the success of the investigation was as much a product of teamwork as of his own decades of experience. The day of Whitmore's sentencing brought a mixture of relief and solemnity. The courtroom was tense, the families of victims present, representatives from law enforcement observing, and media documenting the proceedings. Whitmore received a substantial prison term, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the systematic nature of his actions. The sentencing was a landmark moment, validating years of meticulous investigation and underscoring the legal and moral responsibility of those in positions of authority. For Marcus, it was a moment of professional vindication and personal closure, affirming the value of persistence, attention to detail, and moral courage. Marcus also considered the broader cultural and social impact of the case. The revelations surrounding the preservation of the victims and the concealment of criminal activity challenged public assumptions about trust, authority, and accountability. Conversations emerged about the ethics of medical research, oversight in experimental trials, and the responsibilities of professionals who wield significant power over vulnerable populations. Marcus recognized that, beyond legal outcomes, the case had reshaped societal expectations and reinforced the necessity of vigilance, transparency, and ethical responsibility. For Marcus personally, the conclusion of the case brought a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction at the recovery of truth and accountability was tempered by the lingering sorrow for lives lost and opportunities denied. The restoration of closure to families offered solace, but the knowledge of Victor Hale's escape reminded him that justice, while achieved in part, remained an ongoing pursuit. Marcus understood that the work of protecting the vulnerable, exposing corruption, and ensuring accountability was never fully complete. It required continuous vigilance and commitment. The investigation also inspired reflection on Marcus's own career and life choices. Decades spent pursuing missing persons, confronting institutional failures, and navigating bureaucratic resistance had prepared him for this moment. His retirement, once thought to signal a winding down, became instead a continuation of his lifelong mission, seeking truth, advocating for the powerless, and holding those in authority accountable. The case reinforced his belief that moral courage and professional diligence could intersect to produce meaningful outcomes, even in the face of systemic corruption and personal risk. In the aftermath, Marcus focused on documentation, ensuring that every detail, every piece of evidence, and every procedural note was preserved for future reference. The work extended beyond immediate legal proceedings, creating a resource for investigators, policymakers, and legal professionals. Marcus recognized the importance of leaving a comprehensive record, not only for accountability but also for education, prevention, and ongoing vigilance. The meticulous preservation of knowledge became a mission parallel to the pursuit of justice itself. Finally, Marcus found a measure of personal closure in reflecting on the arc of the investigation. From the first encounter with the wax figure to the final sentencing, each step had required courage, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. The victims' identities were acknowledged, the patterns of exploitation exposed, and legal accountability established for those within reach. Marcus understood that while not all perpetrators had been captured, the truth had been brought to light, families had received closure, and systemic reform had been catalyzed. The work reaffirmed his belief in the enduring value of persistence, moral integrity, and meticulous investigation. Marcus Reed knew that life would never return fully to normal. The shadows of the investigation, the faces of victims, and the weight of knowledge would remain with him. Yet, he also understood that through diligence, courage, and careful documentation, he had made a profound difference. The story of Nia Thompson and the other missing students had been transformed from one of unresolved loss into a narrative of truth, accountability, and reform. Marcus walked forward with a sense of purpose renewed, committed to ensuring that the lessons of the past would guide vigilance, ethical responsibility, and justice in the years to come. The story of Marcus Reed and the decades-long search for Nia Thompson carries lessons that extend far beyond the confines of a single investigation. At its core, it demonstrates the enduring power of persistence and moral courage. In a world where systems often protect those in positions of authority and obscure wrongdoing, the unwavering commitment of an individual to seek truth and justice can disrupt carefully constructed facades. Marcus's journey illustrates that persistence is not simply about following leads or collecting evidences. It is about maintaining a moral compass when the easy path is silence, when the world is content to overlook inconvenient truths. Persistence requires patience, resilience, and an understanding that meaningful change often emerges from prolonged, meticulous effort rather than swift, immediate action. The narrative also highlights the critical importance of vigilance and critical thinking, particularly in environments where power and wealth create barriers to accountability. Authority can be misused to manipulate perception, suppress inquiry, and conceal harm. The story reminds us that the veneer of legitimacy, whether in corporations, institutions, or individuals, can mask egregious ethical violations. Marcus's methodical analysis of records, photographs, timelines, and behavior exemplifies the need to question appearances and seek corroborating evidence before drawing conclusions. This vigilance is not just professional, it is moral. Recognizing when trust has been exploited and when systems have failed requires an attentive, questioning mind, one capable of seeing through layers of obfuscation that others accept at face value. Another crucial lesson is the human cost of negligence and deliberate concealment. The story underscores the devastating consequences for victims and their families when crimes are hidden behind authority or bureaucracy. Nia Thompson's life, and the lives of the other missing participants, were erased in a way that transformed human tragedy into an object of study and curiosity. The emotional toll on the families, who endured years of uncertainty, illustrates the ethical responsibility to safeguard the vulnerable and ensure transparency. It is a stark reminder that every decision made by those in positions of power has human ramifications, and that accountability is not merely a legal imperative, but a moral one. The emotional dimension of the investigation reinforces the idea that justice is not only about facts and evidence, but about restoring dignity, recognition, and closure to those harmed. The story further emphasizes the interplay between individual initiative and systemic reform. Marcus Reed's relentless pursuit of truth did more than resolve a cold case. It exposed structural flaws that allowed exploitation to persist. His actions catalyzed change in regulatory frameworks, institutional oversight, and ethical considerations in medical research. This teaches the lesson that individual courage, when combined with meticulous evidence and strategic action, can influence broader systems, preventing future harm and fostering accountability. True impact requires not only uncovering wrongdoing but also translating those discoveries into lessons, reforms, and protective measures that extend beyond the immediate case. Finally, the story is a meditation on the ethical obligations of both witnesses and investigators. Marcus's dedication to documenting every detail, verifying every connection, and anticipating resistance underscores the importance of integrity, thoroughness, and moral responsibility. It reminds readers that doing what is right often involves risk, discomfort, and the willingness to confront powerful interests. Courage is not merely about facing danger, but about maintaining ethical clarity and steadfast commitment to truth in the face of intimidation. In this sense, the story is a call to action. It illustrates that each of us has a responsibility to confront injustice, challenge corruption, and advocate for the vulnerable, even when doing so is difficult or inconvenient. In sum, the narrative of Marcus Reed teaches that truth and justice require more than intention. They demand persistence, vigilance, ethical rigor, and the courage to confront both human malice and systemic failure. The story illustrates the moral imperative to protect the vulnerable, the need to question appearances, and the enduring impact that careful, principled action can have on both individuals and society. It underscores the idea that accountability is a continuous process, one sustained by those willing to navigate complexity, risk, and ethical ambiguity to ensure that wrongs are exposed and rectified. Most importantly, it is a reminder that even in the face of institutional and personal obstacles, steadfast commitment to truth can illuminate hidden injustices, restore dignity to victims, and inspire systemic change that safeguards the future. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.